Hello everybody! Today we're going to learn how to take your photos to the next level in Photoshop. Alright, so for this example we're going to use this photo I shot in Iceland last summer. So when it comes to editing photos in Photoshop, I like to divide it into four main categories: color correction, composition adjustments and or sky replacements if necessary, patchwork, which is basically tidying up everything, taking care of all the little details, which applies to pretty much every photo, or at least for me, as there's almost always something that may have slipped you or some detail you'd like to tweak. And finally, grading. Now, I've divided color correction and color grading into their own categories and spaced them out, which in this case isn't strictly speaking necessary, but especially if you want to add objects in your photos, I found this workflow to be the best and the one that will allow for the most realistic results. But we'll cover that in more detail in a future video. Drop a like if you want to see that next time. And before we start, if you want to follow along with this tutorial, you can download this photo from the link in the video description. Anyway, let's get right into it. Right, so as we import the photo in Photoshop, we'll be prompted with this pop-up, which will bring up Camera Raw. So here it's worth noting that you can also start this tutorial in Lightroom. In fact, there's a feature which will allow you to import a photo from Lightroom directly into Photoshop. So with this first step, we're gonna correct the colors until they look right. Here, for instance, the photo is a bit underexposed, so we'll bring up the exposure and tweak it from there. We'll add some contrast, bring up the whites a bit, and bring back some more contrast with the blacks. We'll also bring up the texture and clarity, which will bring out all its crispy detail. We'll also add a bit of dehaze to further reduce the softness of the image. And finally, we'll add just a bit of vibrance, but not that much, as we'll give it more color later. So for now, we'll not touch any of those other tabs, apart from one, lens correction. Under Profile, we'll enable both Remove Chromatic Aberrations and Enable Profile Correction, which will look at the XMP data of the photo to understand which camera and which lens was used. And we'll distort the image ever so slightly to compensate for the unavoidable distortion which every lens bakes into every image that comes out of it. Please note though that this only works if you imported a RAW shot. There you have it, another great reason to shoot RAW. But if you didn't and you're working with a JPEG, you'll need to select your camera brand and lens manually. Once you're done with that, go ahead and import your image. But before doing anything else, let's crop it in a bit, so we won't have to deal with all of that grass in the foreground, and the central owl, which is the focal point of the whole image, won't appear as tiny. Okay, now we need to remove any distracting elements. In this case, I want to remove this grass here in the foreground. So just select it with the lasso tool, make sure you have a good selection, remove or add any section which you might have missed, and then what I recommend to do, especially with these large selections, is to smooth them out, so you'll have less chances of getting visible seams after we run the Content Aware filter. So just go here under Select, Modify and Smooth. Give it 100 pixels and click OK. Now that we have softer edges to our selection, we'll go under Edit and choose Content Aware Fill. On this pop-up, we can choose with this brush the area that Photoshop will sample to fill in the area we selected. So let's remove the sky, as that may create color difference that we don't want. And finally, once you're happy with the result, click OK. Now, for this other owl, make sure you're a new layer, and we'll use the Clone Stamp tool to remove the bulk of it. Just make sure you have under Sample, Current and Below selected. This allows us to work procedurally and to avoid any destructive changes to the image, which will preserve a better quality and allow us to tweak all these settings later. Once that's done, we'll use the Spot Healing Brush tool to touch it up. Make sure you have chosen Sample All Layers and just go over the section you want to polish off. Now, if you overdid it, you can just click here to the layer mask, click on D on your keyboard to bring back the original colors, black and white, and X to cycle between them. Make sure you have black selected and gently brush over any area you want to remove. Also, make sure you have a soft brush selected to avoid any visible seams. For this smaller aisle, I think the Spot Healing Brush tool will be enough. Just make sure it doesn't overlap with the background. And there we go. Now let's create a new layer, and still with the spot healing brush, let's just touch up on a few things here and there, like small bright spots, this darker section which I find a bit annoying, and generally all the small little detail you feel like are just cluttering up the image and don't really need to be there. Also, before we move on, it's great practice to rename all your layers and keep things organized. So let's call this one foreground, and these two aisles, and this one details. Then I'll group them together and call it patchwork. Now that that's out of the way, let's move on to our final step, color grading. So first, I'll touch up the lighting. Let's create a new layer, call it vignette, and let's add a vignette to the image. To do so, we'll sample a color here, a dark shade of blue, and adjust here a little bit. And then, with a very big and soft brush, let's decrease the flow and paint over the edges. Just like so. Okay, let's decrease the opacity slightly and move on. Now, let's create a new layer and add some light. Let's just pick a bright yellow and add just a little bit of detail. And let's decrease the opacity. Negligible difference, but a nice touch. Let's now add a gradient map. Let's click here and choose one from the purples to bring out the pink and purples of the image. Like this one. Click OK, change the blending mode to overlay, and decrease the fill to something very small, like 4%. Okay, now you can go on and add as many filters as you want to really tweak all the little details, but we'll call it good here for now. So we'll group all these layers and call them grading. Now for the final grade, press Ctrl Alt or Command Option Shift E to merge all layers into a new one, then right click and convert to Smart Object. Now go up into Filters and choose Camera Raw. And now from here we'll just finalize the look of the image. So I'd recommend you to play around with all these settings until you're happy with the result. And now we can add both a bit of vibrance and a bit of saturation. Then I use the point curve for any final fixes to the luminosity and move on to the HSL tab. Now here, just like before, I'd recommend you to just play around with the sliders until you're happy with the result. What you're doing here is adjusting the various shades of every color. So here, for instance, I want to really bring out those sunset colors. As fun fact, this photo was taken at sunset right around midnight. Iceland's just great for photographers. You get like 3 hours of golden hour. Once you're done with the HSL tab, let's move on to the split toning. Here you can add a specific color in both the highlights and the shadows. This is a very powerful tool, but make sure you don't overdo it, as too much of it makes for a very unrealistic result. So here, I'm just gonna push a bit of yellowy orange into the highlights and a bit of turquoise into the shadows. Then, I don't really touch lens correction, as we did everything that we had to when we first imported the image. Then, for this photo, I wouldn't really touch on the grain, as we clearly have enough already. But what I usually do is add a touch more vignette. So, drag the first slider all the way to the left, so we can see what we're working with. Then bring the midpoint to the center of the image and let a bit of highlights through. Finally, dial back the first slider until you're satisfied with it. And finally, calibration. Usually I just use this to finish off grading, adjusting the blues and the reds slightly, but for this photo, it really doesn't need that much of it. And there we go! One last thing I'd like to add is a radial filter to brighten up slightly the focal point. So go back to the first tab, hit the radial filter button, draw one of roughly this size and squish it. Bring it to the center and then right click and reset local correction settings. Now make sure the changes you're about to make affect the inside of the filter and brighten it up slightly. A good rule of thumb whenever you're brightening things with this method is to make sure they don't really stand out, as that may be distracting to the viewer. Once you're done with that, click off of it and there you go. Hit OK and you're done. So this wraps things up. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If so, drop a like. And if you feel like being awesome, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads. Or maybe check out my Instagram account at _thedreamwalker. Anyway, that's been it. See you next time.